I just wanted to start off by basically I wanted to get your opinion on where we're at, broadly speaking, at the moment, with regard to the fight, if you like, for racial equality, because of course it's been a more momentous year than any in living memory, really, with the tragic death of George Floyd and then the events here with the Colston statue coming down.
Well, I say it's been a high profile year. I don't know if things have shifted that fundamentally, but certainly it's in the public consciousness. But remember, we did have the McPherson report. We had the first wave of Black Lives Matter. We had Eric Garner as well. So it has periodically come up as a major issue. But where we are in is very much that, really. We're talking about it, and lots of people are trying to find solutions to it. But the underlying data remains the same, right? It's inequalities in educational outcomes, wealth, child poverty, mental health, experience of the criminal justice system, and that's the challenge. It's much harder to get at those nuts and bolts of society than it is to get at the kind of the narrative, the description of how we would want to live. And I think it's going to get harder to tackle racism for a couple of reasons. One is we are already one of the most socially immobile countries in OECD. Racism is not about being nice to each other. That's a part of it. It's about inequality of wealth and power. So unless we unlock social immobility, you will not really make fundamental change to racism. And secondly, as we go into the economic downturn, we know that the people who are most marginalised will pay the biggest price for that economic downturn and then be least well placed to benefit from any upturn. So we're probably going to see inequalities increase. So it's a real challenge for us all at the moment.
In my research for this interview, I came across a documentary that you made in 2007 about racial issues within Bristol. And within that piece, you said that you felt Bristol was suffering still at that point with a rawness around race. I wonder if now, so many years on, whether you think that is still the case.
Well, the way we relate to conversations about race changes all the time, and we very quickly forget how it used to be yesterday, right? We step into a moment. So take the Colston statue. People say, well, why didn't that come down? As though a year ago you could have just launched a conversation in the city about removing the Colston statue on a public stage, and we just would have had a rational, dispassionate conversation about the statue. That's just not where Bristol has been on its journey. So I think race is still a raw conversation, not least because I think sometimes people struggle in knowing what we're actually talking about. One of the points I often make is that it's not about guilt. My mum is white. I don't go home and give my mum a hard time for being white because racism is real, but we still need to talk about the reality of racism. There is such a thing called white privilege, but my mum and my nan and my granddad did not lead lives of privilege in any way that you would recognise. And so you're holding these things together at the same time, and it's very difficult to hold some things together at the same time, such as white privilege, but my mum not leading a life of privilege as a white person. And that makes the conversation difficult to have. So we just need to, one of the challenges is to get ourselves into a place where we can have a more nuanced, more kind of multidimensional, sophisticated conversation about race that particularly looks at its interplay with class.
Yeah, and you mentioned Colston there. I wanted to get onto that. You talked, and you've done so many interviews around the time of that happening, both domestically and internationally, and you made it very clear that you didn't mourn the statue's removal, and even that you felt it was an insult to you having been there in the first place. But one thing I never heard you say was how that moment when you witnessed it made you feel emotionally. I just wonder if you're able to take off your mayor's hat for a moment, whether you could tell us a bit more about how that really made you feel seeing that happen.
Well, maybe the closest I got to it was sharing that I thought it was historically poetic. It whether you agreed with it being hauled down or not, that full circle of world history, to have someone who made so much wealth from the kidnapping, throwing overboard, the robbery of hope from so tens of thousands of people, 80 odd thousand people, to see that place of that honour, which is a statue is not a history lesson, the statue is about honour, hauled down and rolled through the streets. Again, whether you agree with that or not, to see that poetry to me is pretty obvious. But as I'm at pains to point out, as a mayor, I cannot condone criminal damage. It was criminal damage, but I never would pretend that I didn't think that was, almost musical.
It must have been. I mean, I remember seeing the footage that day and just thinking, oh my God, and people have said this in the past as well, that is history happening in front of our eyes. And I found it an incredible thing to witness as a white person. So as a black person like yourself, it must have just been another level, I would have thought, of emotion seeing that happen.
Well, yeah, but I was pointing out too. No, Colston may well have owned one of my ancestors. And when we use the word ancestor, that makes it sound ancient, like ancient Rome. We're talking about great grandfather, not too many generations back. May have been owned, or probably was, right? So, but I've said even if that wasn't my history, just as a Bristolian, the idea that we'd have a statue up in the middle of the city to someone who made their living from slavering was an insult to me. So, and to people like me, I think, I want Bristol to remember. If we're going to remember, let's remember heroes. Let's remember people who set people free, whatever their form of oppression, be it race, be it gender, be it sexuality, be it. Why don't we remember so many people who fought for the rights of dockers to get decent pay, to limit the working week, that fought to bring an end to child labour within the city. And with the History Commission, these are the fuller Bristol story that we aim to uncover. When we hear about new kinds of lives in the city, the people that have fought for ordinary people to be able to eat, to have hope, there may be different people we would say we should be remembering with our places of honour.
It's been almost 5 months now since the statue did come down, and at the time it was talked about how eventually it would go up in a museum and be put on display. And I just wonder what update, if any, you can give us on when that might happen, and also what the latest is on what it may be replaced by as well.
Yeah. So can I just go back to that previous point, just about how momentous and history being made in the statue? So it may be a bit contrary, but it's also important, as one thing I kept sharing, it's also important not to get tied up in the symbolism of what happened. Yes, it was symbolic, but no one turned up in my office the next day with a memo telling me anything had changed on school exclusions, criminal justice, poverty, mental health, education outcomes, unemployment levels, nothing. So again, we have to always be careful that the symbolic, even particularly when it's really dramatic, doesn't consume the whole bandwidth of the conversation, because otherwise we think, oh, well, we did this amazing thing and nothing changed. Yeah, nothing changed because we pointed our energies at the symbolic act rather than the acts of substance. And remember too that the name of Colston Hall was changed. Now it's Bristol Beacon. And again, that hasn't, even though that was actually the big aim in many ways, it was this music venue in the middle of the city, that has captured nowhere near the level of interest. Why? Because it wasn't pulled down, because it maybe happened in a ordered way in which people were consulted. So in some sense, what we're caught up with is the event, not just the act of changing the name. And it's worth unpicking that, right? Because we can then get caught up in events. But the process is going to be tied in with the work of the History Commission. It's not the History Commission's job to come up with what goes on that plinth or whatever we do with it. But what we want the History Commission to do is help Bristol understand the fullness of its story. All these other stories that have not been told, that we don't come into contact with, as well as having a fuller understanding of Colston, by the way, that he was only in Bristol for 2 years anyway or so. He didn't live here for anything of substance. The statue was put up 170 odd years after he passed away, and was somewhat created as a founding father myth to help manage the working class, actually, in many ways, to bring them back into line. So that History Commission will tell a fuller story about who we are, and with that fuller knowledge, I hope that we will be in a position as a city, a much stronger position to come together to agree who we want to celebrate and why, if anyone. in the meantime, the plinth can stay empty, and I don't think there's any rush. The future's not going anywhere. An empty plinth is about, to me, is where we are. We're looking for answers and we haven't got them. So let's leave the space. And dare I say one other thing? It's not down for any individual to choose what goes on the plinth. Colston was put up by a rich man, Arrowsmith, right? Didn't get any money from the city. One person decided what was going to go on there. Obviously had some support from the city, elements of the city decision makers, but that's not the way it's going to be in the future. It's not going to be one person, be it me or anyone else deciding. It's got to be the city's conversation, and the city's expression goes in that space.
Yeah, and you talked there about not getting carried away in the symbolism of what happened. I wonder, is that a roundabout way of you saying that you've gone off slightly? The idea of it being put up in a museum, is that still the plan? Is that going to happen eventually?
Yeah, it will go in display, because while I'm saying be careful about the symbolism is still important as long as it's attached to real policy. But whichever way you cut it up, the world looked at Bristol, and the toppling of that statue was significant. So I'm holding lots of things here at the same time. It's symbolic, but it's not everything, but it is important. So yeah, it would go up probably in the M shed. It would be put on display with some of the placards that were around it as well. So when we're trying to learn about Bristol and what was going on, we can see that on that day in this city, there was an expression actually of a global energy in many ways, that, this is my interpretation, ended up focused on Colston statue and what happened around it. Certainly, whether planned or not, the event captured a global imagination and meant something to the world. So yeah, that needs to go on display.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm going to have to push you a bit on this point, if you don't mind. So when is the statue going to be going up in a museum? I remember the article that came out initially from the council saying that it is going to go up in a museum eventually. It was suggested that that might happen around this sort of time, autumn time. Is that still likely to happen? What update can you give us on that?
It would be on display by early next year. It's just about getting all the process around it right, and making sure that the statue, there's been some work on the statue to make sure it doesn't further corrode. It has to be cleaned up, leaving obviously it's not going to be fixed. The dents will be in it, the paint will be on it, the placards will be around it. So the museums team are just going through that process now, but it will be on display.
Yeah, and again, in the build up to this interview, I listened to a podcast that you did with Annie Mack, the Radio 1 presenter, Changes. And within that, you made an interesting point that I just wanted to ask you about. And I'm conscious that I may be putting words in your mouth here, so if you feel that what I'm saying here isn't fair, please feel free to correct me. But the impression I got was that at times you worry or are concerned about tackling racial issues as much as you might ideally like to, because you're concerned or fearful about being labelled as, oh, he's only doing this because he's a black man. I just wonder, firstly, is that a fair characterisation? And secondly, if that is the case, do you feel that the toppling of the Colston statue has actually helped you, in the sense that it's forced your hand and forced you to tackle these issues head on when otherwise you may not have done?
The irony of being a black politician or a black leader is more is expected of you on race, and yet you have less latitude for doing anything on race. So the expectations are high. So Barack Obama, I'm not claiming to be Obama, but Barack Obama was supposed to be a sign of the end of racism. And you've heard people say, well, we had Obama, he didn't end racism. Right, so he comes along after 400 years and he's supposed to solve it. And then when he doesn't, you blame the black guy. I mean, so the expectations are high. But it is the case that people have referred to me as an inner city mayor, right? That's code for black mayor. And whenever I say anything on race, people will then say, well, he's just all about race. That's all he's interested in. And that happens quite easily. So the point is, as a black politician, you just have to be particularly astute and particularly wise. It doesn't mean you're not doing stuff. It just means you don't show your hand every time. But what we are doing in Bristol has been about social mobility. It's been about equality. You know, feeding children, affordable homes, investing in mental health, tackling period poverty, giving work experience to young people who weren't getting access to work experience. These things tackle poverty in general and tackle race in particular. We lift up everyone while recognising that there are specific things about race that are unique to race and racism.
Yeah, when you said there, you need to be more astute. Do you think it actually makes your job harder being black in the context of trying to tackle racial issues? Does it frustrate you how people perceive you because of that?
I'm just used to it. I've always known, you get the line. I mean, women will know this. Well, you would say that, wouldn't you? If you're the only woman around the table and you say something, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? Me, black, if I say something about race, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? You just have to manage yourself. Most of us do. But look at the experiences of working class people, right? You start talking about class, I'll chip on the shoulder, class warrior, right? If you come from a group that's designated, like a group, and you begin to say things that challenge the status quo or the establishment, you generally are labelled in some way, and you can be labelled as a troublemaker or one-dimensional, and that's all you do. And we just have to manage our image. All of us who are trying to make change have to manage our image. Interestingly, and I saw this through Brexit with Farage and Boris Johnson and even with Donald Trump, the way one of the surest ways you can see that someone's a member of the establishment is that they can rail against the establishment without being seen as people who have a chip on their shoulder. It's surprising. Look at the from our Prime Minister to the US President to Farage, always going on about the establishment, always going on about the elites. If I was talking like that, you'd be seeing me as some mad class warrior, right? Some dangerous Malcolm X-ish type person who's going to throw everything over. So that kind of, maybe that illustrates to you the different fields on which we in which we play. It is about race, but it's also about class and gender and sexuality and other things that designate us to specific groups.
I mean, it's such a loaded question. Where do you start? But how do you begin to solve that problem? Do you think? Because it seems like such a huge issue going forward.
I don't know if it's solvable. You just got to be astute. Like I said, I try to hit on many fronts at the same time. So I won't be pigeonholed. So, but yeah, I'm doing stuff on race. I am, yeah. I'm doing stuff on child poverty as well. We're feeding children, white kids, right? So I don't want to be pigeonholed. Am I ignoring women? Well, 50% of my cabinet is women. Deputy Mayor is a black woman. One of our biggest campaigns in the city, led by Helen Godwin, is around period poverty, an issue that particularly affects women. So my hope is that what people can see is, yeah, he's doing stuff on race, but he's doing stuff on class too. Yeah, he's doing stuff on women's issues. Yeah, he's doing stuff on for LGBTQ people. And we're doing that. It won't mean that we are equally successful on all fronts. And some days we'll be more successful in some areas than others, and that will change on other days. But hopefully people are willing to make space for us to do an issue, to take action on an area that may not seem to them to be of immediate relevance, because we are doing stuff for them also.
I want to get onto education, because as many people did after the death of George Floyd and the protests that surrounded that, and also the toppling of the Colston statue, I went out and got some books on the issue of race, both in Britain and more widely, to try and educate myself more. And one of the books that I've been reading since is Black and British by David Olusoga, and there's many fascinating facts that I've come across within that if you don't mind, I just want to list briefly now some of them, and then I'll come to my question after, but in no particular order, some of the things I've come across. The crew that helped Sir Francis Drake circumnavigate the globe in 1577 was multicultural. It included black men. 123 West Indians fought as part of the British Navy at Trafalgar alongside Nelson, and actually on Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, in the depiction of Nelson's death on HMS Victory, there is a black man fighting alongside not just Nelson but also white sailors within a few feet of the Admiral. When the Romans came and colonised Britain in the 3rd century AD, black Africans were among their legions fighting freely. Well, that's well over 1,000 years before Britain then went on to colonise Africa, and also the first known black person to have lived in Britain in either the 2nd or 3rd century, around the same sort of time. Lived in Sussex and was, it's thought, not poor because they were found, archaeologists have found that they had a healthy, balanced diet. My question is, how many people do you think know these things?
Not many, which is why, well, the reason why David is so important as a historian today. But we don't. And the point is, this is our history. There's a fantastic piece in his TV series on Black British history where there's a white person who finds out that his great grandfather, whatever it was a black man. And takes a real sense of fullness in his character within that. This is our hidden history. It's part of what made Britain what it is today. And one of the points David often makes is what we're doing is just doing good history. It's not about guilt. It's not about anything else. Just about doing good quality history.
And what do you think that says about the state of our education system?
Well, it certainly points out as problematic. One of the points Tim Cole, who's chairing the History Commission, has made is he wants to ask a question with the History Commission: what have we remembered, or what have we chosen to remember? But the flip side to that question is going to be, well, what have we forgotten, accidentally or consciously? Because we have, in the process of remembering some things, we've forgotten other things, and those things actually may lift up certain people groups or say that actually you do exist, you have made a contribution to this country's history, helping us become what we are. It's not just down to a few rich old aristocrats, at particular points in time. So I think it's evidence of bad history that we're getting access to.
And you have again been vocal on the past, so I've just got one more question after this one as well, about how you want to make an effort to try and get more black and minority ethnic teachers into schools across Bristol. Is that part of tackling that problem, do you think? Is that why you're doing these things? Well,
that's not just a history problem. They could be science teachers. I mean, they could be mathematics teachers and geography teachers, not just history. I mean, that's just about making sure that the workforce that we have working with the city reflects the city and is equipped to meet the needs of the city. We know that education inequalities is one of the key drivers of broader racial inequalities within the city, and a more diverse workforce is one that will be, a more teaching force is one that will be better to able to understand the diversity of our city and to meet its needs. And that's good for all of us, not just black kids. That's good for Bristol.
And just lastly, when your time as mayor comes to an end, be it next summer or 4 years further down the line, how do you hope the public, both here in Bristol and more widely, will look back on your time in the context of race as the first black mayor of a city in the UK?
No, it's also a danger for black politicians that they are just known as the black politician. Actually, it's really important that we're known as people who could think strategically, set priorities, represent us on the international stage for trade, and we're not just here as a cultural curiosity. That's really, really important. So I would say I hope that maybe I've opened the door for other people to come, because we've led the city in a serious way. We've taken on serious challenges. We've exploited serious opportunities, and it means that the whole image of what it means to come from a background like mine and become mayor of Bristol is seen with a degree of credibility. But when I say about my background like that, let me just add that extra dimension to it. It is about being black. It's about being a mixed race kid. But it's about coming from a single parent, a white woman, living on a housing estate, and then moving to the city and going to a comprehensive school. All of these are really important badges to my identity, or as facets to my identity that I hope other people coming through those pathways will say, yeah, that's okay, he's one of us. I did have an experience in Lawrence Weston, an amazing experience actually, back in 2012, so it wasn't this election, when a guy came to the door when I was canvassing And I'm going to be stereotypical, but he looked like a darts player, big tattoos on the arm. I thought, oh gosh, here we go. And he said, white guy, he said, I'm voting for you, you're one of us. And that was a hugely healing moment for me. It was incredible. You know, transcending race at that particular point in time. We share a background. You're one of us. That's very special.